Welcome to the Your Pennsylvania Ancestors podcast. This is Denise Allen with an episode on adoption records. If you're watching this episode on YouTube, I have some Christmas lights up behind me to celebrate the season. I'm looking forward to sharing with you what I learned about researching adoption in Pennsylvania, hoping that it helps you find your adopted ancestors. Welcome to Your Pennsylvania Ancestors with Denise Allen. Now, the first thing to realize about adoption is it is a formal process, and we think of it in our modern mindset of being a long process that takes months or years. It involves the court in the process of adoption, and we are formally taking a child's biological parents away from them, or maybe they died, and assigning that child who's under the age of 18 to new parents. And it's usually two parents in the adoption process. So what I'm going to talk about today in the podcast is records around that formal adoption process. I think the first thing that we need to do as genealogists around this issue is really try to remove as much of our own thinking around it and cultural sort of expectations. So this is really hard to do. You know, a lot of times when we start genealogy research, we're just doing names and dates and using different records, and it all goes along swimmingly until we hit these places where we get stuck and we realize maybe through a DNA test that there was an adoption involved. There was the person that we think are the parents of this ancestor aren't in fact the biological parents. There's something else going on here. So in that process of figuring out what was going on or what went on, we need to remove our thinking. We need to kind of wipe out our brain of what we think should have happened, what our expectations are, what the norms are for today of how we handle these things, maybe even down to the vocabulary of what we called it and how we feel about it. I will provide you resources so you can get into the mindset of your ancestors. I'm not asking you to accept and approve of everything that our ancestors did. We just need to understand it and just know that this was the way that they did things, or this is the way they thought about things. Now, as we're going through and thinking with our not 20th or 21st century brain, and we're going back to the 1800s or earlier, realize that adoption was not that uncommon. Now, it wasn't formal adoption done with paperwork, but children living with family members due to the death of their parents or poverty of the parents was common. And for a lot of our ancestors, because they were poor and they didn't own land and they didn't have a lot of resources like big bank accounts or precious metals and houses, there's not a lot of records around what happened to these children. You know, children were really in records where the parents had wealth, status, something to pass on, and that child would have been then in a court record. And again, I'm thinking of the 1800s here, 1700s, maybe 1600s, but a lot of records we don't have access to then or don't exist. But those 1700, 1800 records, particularly in Pennsylvania, you're only going to see the child in there in regards to being with a different parent or raised in a different family if their biological parents had some sort of wealth to pass on. And we see that in the form of a guardianship that would be in the orphans court records, and that's at a county level. And you can look for those records, and they are in there. There's not a lot of kids in there, honestly. I've gone through those orphan court records, paged through them, looked in the indexes, and it's rare to find a guardianship in there. Sometimes guardianship came about when just the father passed away, the mother was still living. Sometimes it was both parents had died. So keep that in mind too. This isn't always, both parents wiped out by the flu, let's say, or typhoid, and, the children are left homeless. Also realize too that the children were sometimes divided up across a couple families. And if that was the case, that isn't always going to be shown because maybe the surname's the same and they just sort of blend in. The DNA, obviously very similar. So if you're using DNA as a basis of research, it might not show up that way either. But let me cover in detail the adoption laws in Pennsylvania so you can get yourself oriented as to what was occurring at different time periods and where the shifts were in how we approached adoption here in this state. And our shifts in Pennsylvania were very similar to what was happening nationally. So no surprises if you have been researching in other states, you're going to find similar things here in Pennsylvania. So let's get started with that review. If you are listening to this on an audio podcast, I invite you to go over to my YouTube channel, PA Ancestors, where you can see the slides, and maybe that'll help you retain some of the information. And if you're already on YouTube, welcome. So the first Pennsylvania law was passed in 1855 to formalize adoption. Now, this is an adoption as we think of it today with all its paperwork and processes and consents. This was really just a way to kind of formalize that informal thing that had been happening. And it was necessary for some people in order to pass their inheritance on to children. So you can think of situations where maybe an uncle takes in a nephew and wants to be able to pass some of the wealth on to him that he had accumulated. This was just a very simple law to formalize something that had already been going on for most people. Now, during the time period of the 1840s through the 1860s, there is a huge population boom in Pennsylvania. This was fueled by immigration. This is the time period where we really start seeing factories and manufacturing taking off in cities. The city population of Philadelphia goes from 200,000 people to almost 600,000 people. And the state as a whole doubles its population during the time. So what is the impact of that? Well, when you have a lot of people living in cities with not a lot of clean public water and poor sanitation, you're going to have death and disease. And these are immigrants that likely don't have additional family members or very few family members, or the family members that they do have are in an equally poor state. So we are left with lots of orphan children. The concept of orphan trains begins in the mid-1800s in New York City. Now, there's orphan trains that run out of Philadelphia at this time, and unfortunately, we have no records of those trains. We know from newspaper accounts that they did occur, but we don't know the names of the children that were on there. We don't necessarily know even like what areas of the city they came from. So it's really hard for a genealogist to do anything. But if you have an ancestor who claims they were born in Pennsylvania, particularly in Philadelphia, and they're somewhere in the Midwest or in the countryside of Pennsylvania, they could have been one of these people placed on the orphan trains during the time period of the 1850s all the way through to the 1930s. Now, remember too at this time that the concept of indentured servitude came to an end. This was with the 13th Amendment, which we know is ending formal slavery, but this also stopped the indenture or the actual working off of debt that people would do who were poor. So they would take a child 10, 12, 14 years old and actually have them in employment with another family. And that was ended during this time period. Now, keep in mind, through the 1900s, well into the beginning part of the 20th century, adoption remained informal. So we didn't have formal identification for people during this time. You know, we all know that as genealogists because we would love a birth certificate from the 1750s, let's say. But, you know, we're really looking at people that were in a situation where they needed to place a child, would look to a family member, would look to, worst case, a neighbor. So those are your resources for research, is to really go through and get to know the neighborhoods where your folks lived, to know their religious faith, and that's going to help you with this informal process of adoption. So let's look at the next major changes that occurred. Now, our next changes with adoption, both the law and the process, occur after the Civil War. Obviously, the war has its impact with the amount of death that occurred, and there are war orphans. But we still have going on after the Civil War, all the way through to the early 1920s, another immigration boom. And we have the development of orphanages, aid societies, and asylums. Now, the word asylum is one that sort of triggers us to think of a negative connotation, maybe someone that has a mental health concern that's so serious that they need to be committed. I challenge you to think of the word asylum during this time period as meaning a place of retreat and a place of peace. So that was the intent of that word. It wasn't always the outcome, but think of it as a way that people were using to take care of children that they felt needed care. So during this time period is the concept of child welfare, where the health and condition of the child becomes central. This was a new concept in this country, and again, this is the impact of immigration and early death of parents, poverty, and people not having family connections. During this time period, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, we really start to see the evolution of an adoption agency and government agencies and a formalization of the adoption process. But important to know as a genealogist that the idea of illegitimacy really starts to take hold at this point. This concept of illegitimacy and the stigma around it encourages people to give false names on hospital and birth records. So even as a genealogist, if you're doing your due diligence and you think you have the right birth record, if the information doesn't match in terms of the name, it could mean that somebody gave a false name. Now, this is like the worst thing that can happen to us, right? I mean, we're battling enough inconsistencies in terms of the information. We really don't need people giving fake names at the time of birth. But this is where you're going to need to cross-reference with your DNA in order to really get clear in terms of what is going on and trying to match records and using multiple record sources. There's a series of laws passed in Pennsylvania during this time to equalize adopted children and natural children with adopted families. So this is concerning, again, the passing of inheritance to adopted children, that they would have the same rights as a natural child in a family to what the parents owned. And now what prevents further progress around this until later is the Great Depression and World War II. These are all consuming events for the country. A lot of people are affected and pushed into poverty. So the attention on single children and their welfare becomes less of a concern as we look at communities as a whole and trying to alleviate poverty that way and take care of people. So the next major change to adoption laws occurs in the 1970s through the 1990s. Around 1970, we reach the peak number of adoptions that we have in this country, which is 175,000 children placed with families. Also during this time, beginning in the mid-1960s, we have a whole bunch of liberation movements. We have women's liberation, Black liberation, and we also have an adoption liberation movement, which people are asking to see their birth records. A lot of these records have been sealed for people to prevent this stigma of illegitimacy, but through court orders, people could get access to those, and a lot of times people informally could get access to these records through a friend, someone that they knew at the courthouse. Another major change in the 1970s is Roe v. Wade, which legalizes abortion. There's a lot less children out to be adopted throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s and onward. So that is something to keep in mind as we look at adoption. The next major change is a federal law, which is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. This is where we see the development of the system that we have today in terms of public welfare and child welfare being part of government agencies. So no longer is this solely a religious group that's in charge or other private agency of these concerns. It now becomes a function of government. And the federal government passes this to the states to handle. And throughout the 1970s into the 90s, there's a whole series of laws around how do we evaluate if a child's being abused, how do we evaluate if a child needs to be removed from a home. And in the process of this, because children are removed from homes and then adopted into other families, Pennsylvania decides to seal adoption records. And these is a hard seal where people don't have access to these records at all. This is seen as done for the safety of the child and the adoptive parents. This law was passed in 1984, and it's since been changed slightly, and I'll cover that next. But realize that there's actually a penalty if someone in the government discloses information that should be sealed in terms of adoption. So I copied and pasted that law here so that you can see it for yourself. So it's not that people are trying to intentionally hide information from you, but they don't want to go to pay a fine or lose their job for sharing information that shouldn't be shared. So keep that in mind as you're working with the Department of Health or with a county government. There are serious consequences for them for disclosing information that shouldn't be disclosed. The current state of adoption law in Pennsylvania is found under Title 23, entitled Domestic Relations. Here's some of the basics. The law has been changed since 1984 that now an adoptee over the age of 18 can request their original PA birth certificate. This is the uncertified copy, and that's the one that's really great to have because sometimes it's got some better information on it than the certified ones. At least that's been my experience. This is a request that goes through the Department of Health. I included a link in the show notes so you can read the rules and the fees around requesting that. In the case of a genealogist, if they know someone was adopted, let's say in 1935, and that person has since died, the descendants of that individual can request that original birth certificate. Keep in mind, though, that the state also allows natural parents, and this would be biological parents, to be able to redact their information at any time. Now, this was a more recent law, and maybe people don't know about it, and in some cases, maybe the parents are deceased and unable to do that. But this is something that's possible, that maybe somebody who adopted out a child in 1965 did go and redact their information. So even though you request the record, you're still not going to be able to get what you really are seeking. Keep in mind, too, that agencies and the court both have the right to refuse a record request. So if they believe that there's a safety concern or a criminal intent behind requesting this information, they can absolutely refuse it flat out. So this is where, as a genealogist, we want to be as professional as possible and use all our good manners that our grandparents and parents taught us in terms of making these requests. We certainly don't want to lead people to believe that we're using the information for nefarious means. And I certainly hope that no one is doing that. And it's done out of an intent to just really understand more about our family history. And there's no guarantee that even if you know someone's adopted, that because of the informality, particularly at the early part of the 20th century, that there will be a formal record of an adoption. This summary of the laws at the different time gives you an idea of sort of the mindsets or the constraints that you're working with as you're doing genealogy research in terms of what's available or what people were thinking or doing at the time, and hopefully can lead you to the right record set so you can do the research you want to do. Now, research suggestions. You know that you've got an adopted ancestor in your past. So here's some research tips. First is, I think it's always really helpful to get your mind around the thinking of the times, what people were advocating for, what the mindset was at the time. A great book I found is Family Matters by E. Wayne Karp. It's published by Harvard University Press. And he also wrote a book called Adoption in America. And both books get into the kind of the zeitgeist of the time around adoption. So if you're trying to figure out, well, why did they do that? Why did they change the law to this? What were people thinking? He covers it. For a large part of American history and history in Pennsylvania, adoption was never meant to be secret. It wasn't something that people were ashamed of. It certainly wasn't something a lot of people covered up. People in the community knew about it, especially in rural areas. And it wasn't until the advent of city life, large immigration, and sort of the cultural shifts of the 1920s and then again in the 1970s that we had these changes around adoption laws and what people thought would be helpful. So grab a copy of this book from your library or pick up a used copy or a new copy and, sit down with it and really understand sort of the thinking. And this is a book not written just about Pennsylvania. It covers nationally. So no matter where your ancestor was adopted or where you're dealing with an adoption, a great resource. Now, other research techniques. If you're dealing with an adoption of one of your parents or your grandparents, so this is something recent, DNA is a great help. Where DNA is not as helpful is when we start going back further in time. It's not that it doesn't quote unquote work, it's just that the number of matches we're sorting through to figure out who is the actual biological parent of an individual gets really complicated. So it's totally possible, thank goodness for spreadsheets, to do it, but it's just going to take you more work. And I point you to the experts in DNA on how to do that research, and I will certainly look into doing a future podcast episode to cover how to do that sorting. The Leeds method by Dana Leeds is a great place to start to work through those matches. If you have your DNA tested at Ancestry or 23andMe, it works there too, as well as Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage. So those are the four major players in terms of DNA. For adoptions of any age, like with all genealogical work, the best thing to do is ask cousins, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents for any information, any family stories that they might have. The slightest clue giving a location or a time period or a name that you haven't heard of could help in trying to figure out who the biological parents are for a person in your family tree. A third thing to do is to go through all those records that you've already collected on individuals. Is there a name on that death record or that funeral home record or in a birth record that you don't understand? You might have glossed over it in the process of putting it in your tree. That could be a biological relation to that child who stepped in at a time at death, or a known sibling to that person that you don't know now, but that person knew at the time. Because remember, adoption wasn't something to be ashamed of in all of our history. A very common practice in the 20th century and the late 19th century was for people to write letters into the paper to ask for help in trying to figure out who their parents were or where their parents were. Check newspapers. Check for various names and various spellings for that person. They would write letters, these adopted children, and say what they knew about their birth parents, and with the help that somebody could help them locate that birth family. Oftentimes this was when someone was going off to war, so World War II or World War I, they would have written a letter like this. So check newspapers. There might be a surprise there. Newspapers.com is the biggest subscription service where you can get those. There's also the Chronicling America website, and there is a collection of historic Pennsylvania newspapers available for free, and I link that in the show notes, so check that one out too. Well, I hope all of this gives you some legs to run on with this research on adoption in Pennsylvania. Be sure to check out my other episodes on the various archives in Pennsylvania, because this research, sometimes can take you down unexpected paths, and you want to be prepared when you contact an archive to know what they hold and how to use them. I always love it if you drop a comment or leave a review. It helps other people find the episodes. We live in a time of algorithms. So if our ancestors lived in a time where maybe they didn't have vaccines and antibiotics and easy communication with family members, we live in a time of algorithms, and other people literally cannot find content on the internet unless other people find it first and comment, give it a like, or subscribe. So that is the 21st century world that we live in. And I just hope that when our descendants are going through our records, they're not using algorithms to quite the same extent as we are right now. This is Denise Allen with Your Pennsylvania Ancestors, and I wish you many discoveries on your Pennsylvania ancestors.